You think that medal is some kind of decoration? Mr. Rowan Judge Halridge's cold, cutting voice sliced through the small courtroom landing like a slap across the room's fragile quiet and jolting everyone within the first few seconds. 86-year-old Sam Rowan sat in his worn wheelchair, his thin hands resting gently on the metal rims. He didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the American flag standing silently in the corner, as if the last threads of calm from a lifetime of battle were clinging to the red, white, and blue fabric. Halridge stepped closer, his tone sharper, dripping with disdain. This, he said, was not a place for showing off. If Sam didn't remove that medal immediately, he would be held in contempt of court. People waiting for their minor cases went silent at once. No one spoke. No one moved. The air thickened until you could almost hear someone swallow on the left-hand bench. Sam tilted his head slightly and uttered one simple sentence, soft but forged like steel. This medal stays. The pale blue ribbon on his chest swayed gently, the light catching the small star, just enough to make the young prosecutor, Evan Price, look closer. He knew instantly that something didn't add up. No one wears a mere decoration into a courtroom. Not someone like Sam Rowan. Halridge slammed the gavel, the sharp crack echoing with anger. He warned that Sam was standing on the final edge of contempt. But Sam didn't move. He sat there, steady as a tree that had survived too many storms to be shaken by a raised voice. His silence wasn't weakness. It tightened the tension in the room like a drawn bowstring. Evan slowly rose from his seat. Without drawing attention, he slipped out of the courtroom, stepped into the hallway, and dialed a number he never expected to call in a moment like this. On the other end of the line, only 2 words came back, delivered in a voice as sharp as ice understood. No one inside the courtroom knew that at that exact moment, the wheel of reversal had begun to turn. From the quiet of one old veteran, a storm was taking shape, one that would sweep through the entire room in just a matter of minutes. If you believe that true courage is never found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have lived through war, then subscribe to brave veteran stories, so we can preserve the memories, the dignity, and the honor of our quiet heroes. Sam remained motionless in his old wheelchair, as if the chaotic wind stirred up by all the shouting could no longer reach him. His ears tuned in to the ticking of the wall clock, each steady beat sounding like the footsteps of a past he had tried so hard to forget. A quiet stillness settled over the room, yet inside Sam's mind, the past began shifting, rising like brittle pages caught by an unexpected gust. His hand rested lightly on the wheel rim, rough with calluses and lined with pronounced veins. The faint burn scars on his skin were more than traces of fire. They were decades of silence carried by a man willing to stand firm in places where no one else could. Every tiny scar was a story Sam had never told, not because he couldn't, but because he never thought he needed to. For him, surviving had already been a statement of its own. From a seat in the back row, Evan Price kept his eyes on the pale blue ribbon around the old veteran's neck. He couldn't explain why it unsettled him, but he knew immediately it wasn't some cheap ornament. The glint on that ribbon wasn't just the courtroom lights. It was something a person raised in a military family could recognize instantly: truth. A truth he couldn't yet put into words, but one his body reacted to before his mind could catch up. Inside Sam's thoughts, a thin fragment of memory rose like morning mist on a freezing dawn. He felt again the cold wind cutting through the trench lines of long ago, heard the sharp whistle of air against torn sandbags. And then a young voice echoed from somewhere deep in his memory. "Hold your ground, Rowan." That voice belonged to a young soldier who had long since stopped breathing. Yet the sound remained intact, unchanged, unwavering, as sharp as the first day it was spoken. Sam remembered the moment the silver star first touched his skin. It hadn't felt like pride. It had felt heavy. The cool metal laid against him that day wasn't a reward. It was a reminder that some men never returned to hear the applause meant for them. Every time he touched that metal, he remembered the faces of those who had remained behind in the frozen silence. His breathing slowed, but his eyes stayed firm. Not firm out of defiance toward an arrogant judge, but firm because he carried the memories of those who had leaned on him during their final hours. For Sam, silence was never weakness. It was a form of respect. A heavy footstep snapped him back to the present. The bailiff was approaching his leather shoes, pressing down on what felt like the last nerve in the room. Sam didn't turn, but he sensed the man's large shadow falling over him. And in that moment, Sam understood that the stillness he had fought to hold on to was about to be torn apart by a man in a black robe, someone who had never understood anything greater than his own authority. That brief pocket of quiet lasted only a few more breaths, Because Judge Halridge was preparing to deliver his hardest blow, one he didn't yet realize would land on a man who never belonged to the small, narrow world he had built. Judge Halridge didn't wait another second. He tightened his voice and ordered bailiff assist the defendant. Immediately. It was a short sentence, but it landed with the weight of a hammer on a table, a signal that the patience of authority had run out. The bailiff stepped forward, his shadow falling over the small, aging veteran seated in the wheelchair. That shadow stretched long and heavy, much like the pressure the entire room was placing on the shoulders of Sam Rowan, who had once carried far heavier burdens through war. Sam lifted his head. His old eyes, sharp and clear despite the years, gave the impression of steel that had been through fire. He did not tremble, did not flinch, did not show the slightest hint of weakness. He simply looked straight ahead without saying a word. And it was that silence that made the bailiff hesitate before he finally muttered, "He's refusing, Your Honor." Halridge let out a thin, disdainful smile, the smile of a man convinced that the black robe on his shoulders allowed him to crush anyone beneath it. "Then he will spend 48 hours in custody and undergo a psychiatric evaluation." His tone carried no hint of doubt, as if humiliating an old veteran was no more unusual than signing another parking citation. The courtroom stirred uneasily. A couple of distorted, mocking laughs slipped out from the back rows. Sounds that felt like dull blades scraping across the hearts of those who still understood respect. Some lowered their eyes out of embarrassment. Others cast Sam irritated or dismissive looks as if he were the one causing trouble. The thin layer of respect that had existed in the room was trampled without hesitation. Evan Price gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. His heart was pounding so fiercely he felt it might burst out of his chest. He stepped back toward the doorway, then stopped. Something inside him was rising. Something telling him that this was wrong. Completely wrong. In that instant, Sam slipped into another fragment of memory. The sound of artillery in the distance, the crunch of frozen dirt cracking under brutal cold, the image of a fallen comrade lying right beside him, breath drifting into the air, like the last flicker of a dying flame. Sam felt that cold again, the cold of a winter that seemed to have never left his bones. Every time those memories surfaced, they carried not only pain, but the weight of a promise he had kept his entire life. Then the noise of the courtroom pulled him back to the present, the noise of disrespect and authority being abused. Halridge pointed directly at him, his voice reverberating with threat. "Respect this courtroom or face the consequences." Sam looked straight into that angry face and whispered, his voice raspy but cutting as clean as a blade. "You don't understand what respect costs." The words weren't loud yet. The entire room heard them. A few people instinctively held their breath. Perhaps they understood just for a moment that the old man before them wasn't talking about the judge's chair, or the law, or defiance. He was talking about something he had paid for with blood, with loss, with a kind of quiet suffering no one else in that room had ever carried. The bailiff remained there, awkward and unsure. Evan stood by the door, eyes fixed on the ribbon at Sam's collar. That image alone, simple, small, spoke more powerfully than any legal argument could have. Sam remained still, his hands in the same position as before, as if he were the only person in the room unmoved by the threats surrounding him. Halridge believed he had won. He believed his authority was absolute, and that one crack of the gavel could make the old man bow his head. But Sam did not bow. His steadfast silence was a wall the judge could neither comprehend nor break. And it was precisely that silence, unadorned, unwavering, that triggered a chain reaction Halridge could never have imagined. Out in the hallway, Evan began making the phone call that would change the entire confrontation. Evan Price stood in the hallway, his hand still gripping his phone tightly. He took a deep breath, then dialed a number he never thought he would call under circumstances like this. When the line connected, Evan spoke immediately, his voice trembling, but clear, "Sir. The man's name is Samuel Rowan." A sudden silence swept through the other end of the line. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of someone who had just heard something unacceptable. Then a steel-hard voice answered, "Say that again, Price." Evan swallowed his throat dry. "Samuel Rowan, sir." There was no verbal response, but Evan heard the unmistakable sound of a chair crashing back, the kind of sound that marked the moment when the situation no longer belonged to a small, low-profile courtroom. Papers hit the floor. Files flipped open, as if a gust of history had blown through the other end of the call. "Where is he?" Colonel Rourke asked, his voice lower, but carrying the pressure of a direct order. Evan recited the courthouse address immediately, each syllable as clear as if he were reading a field operations code. "Stand by." Rourke's reply wasn't loud, but sharp enough to tell Evan that everything had just shifted into an entirely different arena. At the Army installation, less than 20 minutes away, Colonel Rourke didn't waste a second explaining. He cut straight through the hallway and pushed open the door to General Marcus Ellery's office without knocking. The meeting inside fell silent at once. Officers turned their heads surprised to see such uncharacteristic urgency from a man known for his discipline. Rourke spoke only 2 words, Samuel Rowan. Every motion in the room stopped. One officer froze with his pen still lifted above his notebook. General Ellery, the man renowned for remaining calm, even in the tensest moments, lifted his head, and his face changed instantly. Not out of fear, but from a deep rising blend of respect and anger. Rowan, he asked again, as if needing confirmation for something too significant to believe. Confirmed, Rourke replied. No one added anything. No one had to. General Ellery stood up at once. Get my uniform. And the car. He paused only for a heartbeat. We leave now. It wasn't a shouted order. It was a short statement that moved through the room like an alarm bell. The officers exchanged glances, all of them understanding that they had just witnessed the start of something larger than any meeting or agenda for the day. As soon as the convoy rolled out, the ground trembled softly beneath the armored wheels. Soldiers near the motor pool traded glances. No one spoke, but every one of them understood what those 2 words meant. Rowan, a young private, whispered, after all these years, he's still alive. Another soldier exhaled heavily and replied, if it's him, then of course. On the way to the courthouse, General Ellery's expression didn't change. He stared straight ahead, carrying the fierce, disciplined resolve of someone who had faced life-and-death decisions without blinking. To him, this was not about rank or position, or a petty courtroom dispute. This was about honor, the honor of a man the entire army regarded as a benchmark. Rourke sat beside him, feeling the atmosphere gather like a storm. Not a storm of anger, but of reverence. Because they knew one truth: if Samuel Rowan was disrespected anywhere, then that place would have to answer to the very history he embodied. As they neared the city, more patrol vehicles quietly fell into the convoy. Some drivers didn't know the reason, but one glance at the 4-star general's Class A uniform was enough for them to understand that this was no ordinary mission. Rourke checked his watch. Not even 12 minutes had passed since Evan's call. Everything was happening like a chain reaction, fast, precise, unstoppable. A reaction that only ignited when a name heavy enough struck the pride of those who once carried rifles for their country. And as the convoy approached the courthouse, another kind of silence settled over the streets ahead, the silence of justice arriving. Inside, while Halridge continued preparing to condemn Sam, an appearance no one expected was already moving toward the wooden courtroom doors, closing the distance second by second. The courtroom door opened not with force, but with a decisiveness that made everyone inside realize that whoever was walking in did not belong to the ordinary rhythm of this morning. 3 servicemen stepped across the threshold, their boots striking the floor in firm, deliberate cadence, carrying an invisible weight that made the seated spectators rise instinctively. No command was needed. With uniforms like theirs, respect followed as naturally as breath. Judge Halridge spun around, his eyes widening, his mouth stumbling into fragmented sounds that finally collapsed into one broken question. Who are you? But no one answered him. General Marcus Ellery didn't look around, didn't pause to introduce himself, and didn't waste a breath on explanations. He walked straight towards Sam Rowan, seated in his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on the old veteran, as if he were looking at something sacred, something far beyond the authority of a small courtroom. The entire room held its breath when Ellery stopped just 1 step away from Sam. Ellery stood still for a moment. Just one quiet beat, yet enough for everyone to understand that this moment belonged not to the law, but to honor. Then he raised his hand, a slow salute, precise, flawless, so solemn that even those who had never served felt their spines straighten instinctively. The 2 officers behind him saluted immediately, their arms rising like a silent declaration that the man in the wheelchair was no defendant, no petty offender, but someone who had carried honor longer than most of them had been alive. Behind them, Evan Price stood frozen. He felt his heart drop as the truth unfolded before his eyes. Sam Rowan was not just a veteran, he was the kind of man these uniformed officers stood tall to salute. The realization stunned him, and along with it came a rush of shame for not recognizing it sooner. General Ellery lowered his hand, then bowed his head slightly to Sam Rowan, a simple gesture, yet powerful enough to send a shiver through the room. His voice, deep and resonant, carried the echo of battlefield's long-gone Sergeant Major Samuel Rowan. "It is an honor to stand in your presence, sir." The words weren't loud, but everyone heard them. They swept through the courtroom like a cleansing wind, washing away every sneer, every insult, every ounce of arrogance. They shattered the illusion of power Judge Halridge thought he controlled. In that moment, the truth stood plainly before them. Real authority did not rest in a judge's robe, but in men who had once stood on the line between life and death for a country that barely knew their names. Sam looked at Ellery with quiet eyes, as if the two of them were sharing something no one else in the room could ever understand. Not strategy, not battlefield tactics, but the memory of those who never lived to see this day. The entire room seemed to grow lighter, as though an invisible weight had been lifted off every chest. No one spoke. No one even dared breathe too loudly. They simply stood and watched an old veteran receive the honor he had never asked for, yet had never lost. And in that silence, another truth began to take shape, the realization that what they were about to hear next would change the way they saw this man forever. As the atmosphere finally settled, that profound shift quietly paved the way for what none of them could have imagined was coming next. General Marcus Ellery no longer looked at anyone else in that room. He stood tall, turned toward the breathless crowd, and spoke in a deep, steady voice, one that sounded like a reminder of a chapter of history most people had forgotten. He said that if anyone here didn't know the man in the wheelchair, had held a mountain ridge in Korea for 3 days alone, never leaving his position. The moment those words left his mouth, the room exhaled in one collective gasp, as if everyone suddenly realized just how greatly they had underestimated the man before them. Ellery didn't allow the room's emotion to overshadow his responsibility. He continued explaining that Sam Rowan had been shot 3 times, but still managed to save 4 wounded soldiers lying helpless in the frozen mud. Then he said it was Sam himself who had called artillery down on his own position, just to keep his company from being overrun. Each sentence landed like a heavy fragment of truth falling into a room that had never been forced to confront such brutal reality before. Sam closed his eyes, not to escape the moment, but because those images were painfully familiar. He could hear again the whistle of bullets tearing past, feel the sting of frozen mud against his skin, and sense the final breath of the men he had shielded with his own body. Each memory rose within him like a cold current needing no prompting. Only a single voice speaking of that past was enough. General Ellery turned his gaze directly toward the judge's bench and said that the medal the court had ordered removed was not an ornament nor a piece of self-display. It was the Medal of Honor. Those few words, simple, short, and absolute, froze the entire courtroom. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loud. A woman clenched her purse. A man in the back bowed his head. A young spectator placed a hand over his heart. Everyone understood that they had just witnessed one of the rare truths a person might only encounter once in their life. Judge Halridge went pale. His hand shook so violently that when the gavel touched the bench, it didn't make a sound. His face drained of color. Everything he had said, every order he had barked, every insult he had thrown collapsed onto him like a collapsing wall, but no one in the room cared about his panic anymore. Every pair of eyes was on Sam and on the general standing beside him. Ellery concluded with a sentence that carried no anger, only a weight no excuse could withstand. The judge had not merely disrespected an old veteran. He had disrespected every uniform that had ever served this country. Each word struck like a knock on a door Halridge had never known, existed a door that led to true honor. The atmosphere of the courtroom shifted completely. It felt as though someone had lifted a heavy invisible wall off everyone's chest. A sense of lightness tinged with reverence spread across the faces present. Some felt ashamed for laughing earlier. Some straightened their posture. Some felt their eyes sting without knowing why. Amid all those changes, Sam sat quietly calm and unmoving, like the distant mountains he once left behind. And in that moment when the truth finally took its rightful place, the room prepared to move into another chapter of the story, one that only Sam himself could bring into being. Sam looked directly at Judge Halridge. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, only the calm of a man who had lived through far harsher things than shouting in a cramped courtroom. When he finally spoke, his voice was slow, steady, and gentle, each word shaped by years of surviving what many never could. "Respect isn't demanded," he said. "It's earned." The sentence dropped into the room like a stone cutting through the silence. Halridge froze, his eyes blinking rapidly as if searching for something familiar to cling to. But there was nothing left to hold on to. Every insult he had thrown, every order he had forced, all of it stood before him now, like a mirror he was suddenly forced to face. Halridge lowered his head. Not a single word came out. Evans stood beside Sam, eyes shimmering. He had never seen anyone speak about honor with such gentleness and such force at the same time. That kind of calm could only come from someone who had truly seen war. Sam continued, his voice unchanged, but warmer now, as though speaking not just to the judge, but to everyone in the room. We all fail. What matters is what we learn after. The entire courtroom fell into a different kind of stillness. People understood immediately that this was not a reprimand aimed at Halridge alone. It was for anyone who had ever made a mistake, ever judged someone too quickly, ever overlooked the weight carried by an older pair of shoulders. A fragment of memory flashed through Sam's mind. He saw himself again, in the gray, frozen snow, placing a steadying hand on the shoulder of a trembling young soldier whose lips were purple from fear and cold. He heard his own voice echo back from decades ago, "Stay with me, son." The words, though, born on a distant battlefield, remained unchanged. They were more than encouragement. They were a promise to protect the ones who couldn't protect themselves. As the memory faded like mist, Sam opened his eyes and looked around the courtroom. The faces watching him now were the faces of ordinary people who suddenly felt they had learned something life had forgotten to teach them. He spoke again, his voice filled with sincerity. "Treat people well, especially the ones you think can't fight back." Each word moved through the air like a lesson passed down from someone who had lived long enough to understand the true weight of compassion. The room sank into another silence, not the silence of fear or tension, but the silence of change. Some lowered their eyes in shame. Some clenched their hands in quiet understanding. Some service members stood straighter. And through all of it, Sam remained seated with the calm of a man who needed no applause, no explanation, no apology. He needed only one thing for the people in that room to understand the true meaning of respect. Evan looked at Sam as if seeing a better version of himself, one he hadn't known existed. And Halridge, head bowed, understood that he had just been forgiven without a single word of forgiveness spoken. The rest of the courtroom slowly exhaled like something heavy had finally been lifted and returned to its rightful place. From that silence, the story began to move into a new chapter, one whose consequences and awakening would spread far beyond the four walls of that courtroom. What happened afterward didn't just change a single hearing, it changed an entire system. A week later, the small town where the hearing had taken place seemed to carry a different atmosphere altogether. News had spread within days, and what Judge Halridge once believed was a mere internal matter had now become a textbook example the entire state was forced to reevaluate. The state's Judicial Council issued an immediate and indefinite suspension. No appeals, no plea for leniency. Their statement was brief, a severe lack of understanding regarding veteran culture and conduct that dishonored those who had served. During that same week, the State Bar introduced a new mandatory training program. They called it the Rowan Protocol. A short name, but one heavy enough for everyone to understand that it carried the legacy of a man who had silently endured humiliation, and in doing so, awakened an entire system. The program required every judge, prosecutor, and courthouse employee to learn about veterans, the wounds they carried, and the basic respect they deserved. Some complained it was too strict, but most nodded, having witnessed what happens when ignorance becomes a blade. The town also chose to do what was right. They dismissed the citation against Sam's fence entirely. Not only that, they sent a full landscaping team to tend to his yard, trimming every branch and restoring the garden behind his home. The crew leader told reporters they did it because they felt honored to serve Mr. Rowan. Local newspapers ran the photos, not for show, but as reminders that kindness once sparked can spread like a warm flame. One quiet afternoon in the nearby park, Sam sat on a wooden bench, watching sparrows peck at the crumbs he had just scattered. His silver hair caught the last light of the day, and the pale blue ribbon of his Medal of Honor swayed gently with each slow breath. No shouting voices anymore. No insults. Only the peace of a man who had weathered enough storms to understand the true worth of stillness. Evan Price approached him. He slowed his steps when he came within a few feet, not wanting to disturb the serenity of the moment. When Sam looked up, Evan managed only one sentence, one he had carried in his heart ever since that day in court. "Thank you for what you taught us." Sam looked at him with eyes calm and kind, as quiet as a lake at dawn. He smiled, not proudly, not sadly, but with the gentle acceptance of someone who had lived long enough to know that the most important lessons are meant to be passed on. "Then make sure you pass it on," he said. That answer made Evan stand a little straighter. No one needed to assign him a duty or give him a ceremony. He simply understood that some responsibilities do not come from rank. They come from the people who inspire you to choose what is right. A soft breeze drifted through the park, making the Medal of Honor ribbon flutter as if responding. In that brief moment, Sam felt something older veterans often tell each other: the past never truly disappears. It simply rests quietly in the heart, waiting for the right moment to remind us that true honor never leaves. The legacy of this story wasn't written in the news reports, the suspension papers, or the new Bar Association curriculum. It lived in the way people in that town began treating one another, with more respect, with more gentleness, with the understanding that sometimes the elderly man who seems ordinary might be the hero they never knew. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, share this video, and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.